Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at some really powerful verses from the Quran, specifically from the 59th chapter, which is called the Mobilization. And this chapter is really interesting because it kind of brings together, like a big historical event with some really important lessons about faith and community.
Yeah.
And even, hypocrisy.
Right.
So I think it'll be a pretty thought-provoking conversation. So
it is. Yeah, let's jump in. Yeah, it's a very unique chapter, in that it takes a specific event.
Okay.
This, the eviction of this Jewish tribe called the Banu Nadir from Medina. Mm-hmm. And it uses it as a springboard to explore these universal themes that are relevant to everyone.
Right.
And this specific event, was known as the first mobilization in Islamic history.
Wow.
And the chapter doesn't shy away from the details of this event.
So for those of us who aren't, Islamic scholars,
right?
Could we just back up for a second and what exactly happened? Like, why was this tribe evicted?
Right. Yeah. Context is key here.
Yeah.
So the Banu Nadir, they had a treaty with the Prophet Muhammad, but they ended up breaking that treaty and siding with his enemies.
Oh, wow.
And that betrayal is what led to their expulsion from Medina.
Okay, so it sounds like this chapter is going to kind of look at the consequences of broken trust and how do you build a real community?
Absolutely, yeah. And it all starts with this powerful reminder that there's something much bigger going on here than just one tribe or one city. The very first verse declares that everything in the heavens and the earth glorifies Allah.
Right.
So it emphasizes his power and wisdom right from the start.
Okay, so setting the scene with this really cosmic perspective.
Right.
So how does the chapter then connect that to what was happening on the ground?
Well, it moves from that cosmic perspective to describe, the actual mobilization. But what I find really fascinating is how it highlights the way that the believers achieved this really kind of unexpected victory.
Okay.
So even though the enemy was, well fortified and strong,
right,
Allah supported the believers in this really surprising way.
Yeah, I can see how that would have been really encouraging for
for sure.
The early Muslims at that time.
Definitely.
But it also makes me think about, how often we kind of attribute our successes to just our own efforts.
Yeah.
And we forget about all these other factors that are involved,
Yeah, that's a really insightful connection.
Yeah.
You've hit on something crucial there.
Okay.
And actually, verse 5 even goes so far as to say that even something as simple as cutting down a tree happens by the will of Allah.
Okay.
So it's this powerful reminder that even when we experience triumph and victory, it's important to stay humble and acknowledge that we don't have ultimate control.
Right. So even within this, military victory, there's this undercurrent of reflecting on, where true power really lies. It's this victory wasn't just about conquering land or something. It was about conquering your own ego, maybe.
Right.
So what happens next? How does this theme of divine will kind of play out in the rest of the chapter?
The narrative kind of takes a turn to the practical realities of what happens after this victory.
Sure.
And specifically what should be done with the spoils of war.
Yeah.
The wealth that's gained from this conquest.
Okay.
And verse 7 is really key here.
So this is where the rubber meets the road.
Right, exactly.
How do you actually apply these lofty principles of faith in the real world?
Exactly. And verse 7 lays out this idea that was actually pretty radical for the time.
Okay.
It states that this wealth shouldn't just be, hoarded by the wealthy.
Right.
But it should be distributed and shared.
Okay.
And it even specifies that relatives, orphans, the poor, and even travelers, should be cared for.
Wow, that's a powerful statement about social responsibility.
It is.
It's this victory wasn't just about getting more stuff. It was about making sure that everyone in the community was taken care of.
Exactly.
It makes you think about, how we celebrate individual success so often without really thinking about the impact it has on everyone else.
Right, yeah. It challenges us to think about how, our own achievements can actually be used to uplift others.
Yeah.
And especially those who are more vulnerable.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've seen how this chapter touches on, divine intervention, humility,
and
even social justice.
Right.
I'm curious, What about the people who are kind of on the losing side of this conflict?
Yeah.
The people who were driven from their homes. What happened to them?
That's where things get even more interesting. Now,
Verses 8 and 9, they offer a really poignant look at, the refugees themselves,
right,
as well as the community in Medina that welcomed them in.
I'm all ears.
Okay.
What's so special about these verses?
Well, on the one hand, they praise the sincerity of the refugees.
Okay.
Those who had to leave everything behind.
Right.
I mean, imagine the courage it took
Yeah.
to leave your home with nothing but the clothes on your back
Yeah.
and have to start over in a completely new city.
Yeah, that must have been so difficult.
Yeah, and yet
Yeah.
they maintained their faith even through all of that hardship.
Yeah, it really speaks to their resilience and the strength of their beliefs,
Absolutely.
to go through all of that.
Yeah, and what's even more remarkable is how the community in Medina responded to them.
Okay.
They didn't just turn their backs on these people in need.
Mm-hmm.
They embraced the refugees and welcomed them in,
Okay.
even though they themselves were facing difficulties at the time. Wow, so they prioritized the needs of others,
Yeah.
even when they were struggling themselves.
Did.
That's really amazing. It's like radical hospitality.
Yeah.
It paints this picture of like a community that really lives out its values.
Mm-hmm.
Putting compassion and solidarity above like personal gain.
It's a powerful example of, what it means to truly be a community.
Yeah.
A community where everyone is valued and supported, regardless of their circumstances.
Right.
But the chapter doesn't stop there.
Okay.
It goes on to contrast this genuine compassion with a much darker side of human nature.
Okay.
Hypocrisy.
Ooh, okay. This is where I feel like things are going to get interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, hypocrisy is something we all encounter,
Oh, yeah.
even today, right? Like, who hasn't met someone who says one thing and does another?
Exactly.
But like, how does it shed light on this problem?
It does. So in a really fascinating way. And it describes these hypocrites as people who, they outwardly claim to support the believers,
Okay.
but secretly they harbored all these doubts and fears.
Wow.
So they were essentially playing this double game,
Right.
pretending to be allies, but really just waiting to see which way the wind would blow.
Right. So like fair weather friends, basically.
Yeah.
The people who are only there for the good times, and then when things get tough, they kind of disappear.
Right.
But what I find interesting is, the chapter goes beyond just calling them out.
Yes.
It actually tries to understand, like, the psychology of hypocrisy.
Exactly.
Like, what's motivating these people? What's going on in their minds?
Yeah. And one of the most insightful observations in the whole chapter, I think, is in verse 12, where it says that fear of you is more intense in their hearts than fear of Allah.
Wow.
And
Well,
this suggests that their actions weren't really rooted in genuine faith or conviction, but more in, worldly concerns. They were more afraid of what people would think of them
yeah.
than what Allah would think.
It's like their priorities were totally out of whack.
Yeah, totally.
It makes you think about how often, we let fear control our actions,
Yeah.
even when we know deep down that it's not the right thing to do.
Right.
Right. So we're seeing this really clear contrast between the people who are motivated by genuine faith,
Yes.
and those who are kind of driven by fear and self-preservation. It's
Exactly.
like a spiritual litmus test almost.
Yeah.
And then the chapter goes even further, right? It talks about the consequences of this hypocritical behavior,
It does.
and it points out that this deceitfulness,
Yeah.
that it created a lot of distrust within their own ranks.
Right.
Like on the surface, they might have looked united,
Right.
but inside there was all this suspicion and self-interest.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense.
Yeah.
How can you build a strong community
Right.
when everyone is constantly second-guessing each other's motives?
It's like a cancer that just eats away at the fabric of trust, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the chapter doesn't just, stop at highlighting that internal damage.
Okay.
It also connects this hypocrisy to a much broader theme,
Okay.
the importance of learning from the past.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated by how history can offer, guidance for the present.
Yeah, for sure.
So how does this chapter kind of connect hypocrisy to these lessons of history?
Well, verses 15 through 17, they draw this parallel
Right.
between the hypocrites and the people who went astray in earlier times. It reminds the reader that these patterns of behavior,
Yeah.
They're not new.
Right.
You know, people have been falling into the trap of hypocrisy for generations.
Yeah.
And the consequences are always the same.
So it's like a cautionary tale showing us that we're not immune to these temptations.
Exactly.
By understanding, the mistakes of those who came before us, maybe we can avoid repeating them ourselves.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the chapter even takes it a step further by making this really fascinating comparison to the devil's temptations.
Okay.
You know, it's like, just as the devil tries to entice people to disbelief, hypocrisy can lead people down this dangerous path that ultimately separates them from Allah's mercy. That's
a chilling thought, but also really insightful.
Yeah.
It kind of elevates the stakes of the conversation, and it reminds us that our choices have these really significant consequences.
They do.
Yeah.
And the chapter ends with this stark reminder of the ultimate fate of those who choose this path of deceit and hypocrisy.
Okay.
Verse 17 states that they will end up in the fire and they will dwell there forever.
Wow. That's a pretty powerful statement about the consequences of these actions.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that our choices have these lasting repercussions, not just in this life, but in the hereafter as well.
It's a very sobering reminder that our actions carry weight and that we should strive for sincerity in all that we do.
So we've gone on this journey through the mobilization, and we've explored these themes of divine intervention, social responsibility, the dangers of hypocrisy, and the importance of learning from the past. It's been quite a ride.
It has.
But I'm curious, what does all of this mean for us today?
Right.
Yeah. How can we apply these lessons to our own lives?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah. It really feels like this chapter just has so much wisdom packed into it.
Yeah.
It's like, it's a plan for building a better world, but it's also like a warning about all the things we need to avoid.
Right.
Along the way.
I think that's a really good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's this blend of guidance and cautionary tales all connected to this historical event.
So as we kind of wrap up our look at this chapter, is there any one message that really stands out to you?
What keeps coming back to me is this idea of balancing individual responsibility with the needs of the community.
Okay.
The chapter really highlights how we're not just individuals living in isolation. We're all part of something much bigger.
Yeah.
And our actions have an impact on everyone around us.
That's so true. It's easy to get caught up in our own, personal goals and ambitions and stuff.
For sure.
But this chapter reminds us that we have this responsibility to help our community and make sure everyone is doing well.
Right.
But how do we actually do that? How do we find that balance?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right.
But I think, maybe this chapter is encouraging us to always be thinking about that tension.
Okay.
To be aware of how our choices affect others and to try to find solutions that benefit both ourselves and the community as a whole.
Yeah, it's like it's calling us to think beyond just ourselves and consider the needs of everyone around us.
Absolutely.
But I also keep thinking about that section on hypocrisy.
Yeah.
It feels like a warning.
Yeah.
Not just for individuals,
right,
but for whole societies,
It does. And that kind of brings up another question that I think this chapter is asking us. Where do we see hypocrisy happening in our own time? Are there places where we as a society are saying one thing but doing something completely different? Or even within ourselves, are there areas where our actions don't match up with our values?
Ooh, those are tough questions.
They are tough questions.
But important ones,
Yeah.
It's hard to look at ourselves and see how we might be contributing to, systems or behaviors that are actually causing harm.
It's not easy, but that self-reflection is so important. If we actually want to create a world that reflects those values of compassion and justice and sincerity that this chapter is all about.
I couldn't agree more. It's about holding ourselves accountable, both as individuals and as a society.
Yes.
So as we kind of finish up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I'm left with this feeling of hope, but also the sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
Hope, because, this chapter shows us what's possible when we really prioritize faith and community and sincerity, but also responsibility, because it's challenging us to face that hypocrisy head on, and to actually try to build a world that's more just and more compassionate.
I think you said it perfectly. It's a call to action for each of us to live out these values in our own lives.
Right.
And to work together to create a world where those values can flourish.
Well, thank you so much for walking us through this exploration of the mobilization. It's been such an interesting conversation.
It really has. It was my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We hope you found it as thought-provoking as we did.
Yeah.
And remember that the journey of learning and self-discovery, it never really ends.
It doesn't.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep trying to make the world a little bit better.
Great advice.
Until next time.
Yeah.
It really feels like this chapter, it's packed with this wisdom that's, relevant no matter what time period you're in.
Yeah, it's like a guidebook, for how to create a better world.
Right, but also like a warning about the traps we need to watch out for along the way.
Exactly. Yeah, it's both. It's both.
So as we wrap up, this deep dive into the mobilization, is there any like one message that really sticks with you, like something that feels particularly relevant for us today?
I think what really resonates with me is this idea of finding that balance between, our own personal responsibility and the needs of our community.
Right.
This chapter really drives home the point that we're not just, isolated individuals. We're all connected. We're part of something much bigger. And the things we do, they have a ripple effect on everyone around us.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in our own lives, our own goals.
It is, yeah.
But this chapter is like a reminder that we also have this responsibility to contribute to something larger than ourselves.
Right, to the well-being of the whole community.
Exactly. But like, how do we find that balance?
That's a really good question, and I don't think there's like a simple, one size fits all answer. But I think what this chapter is maybe trying to tell us is that we just need to keep thinking about it.
Okay.
To always be aware of how our choices are affecting other people, and to look for solutions that are good for both ourselves and the people around us.
So it's like a call to be more mindful, to think beyond, just our own immediate needs, and to really consider the needs of everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I keep coming back to that section on hypocrisy. It feels like a warning.
It does.
Not just to, individuals, but to entire societies,
It does, yeah. And that actually makes me think of another question that this chapter is kind of posing to us.
Okay.
Where do we see this hypocrisy playing out, in our own world? Are there ways that we as a society are saying one thing, but our actions are telling a completely different story? Right. Or even, within ourselves. Are there places where, what we're doing doesn't really line up with what we believe?
Oh, those are really tough questions.
They are tough questions.
It's not easy to look inward like that and see how we might be contributing to, systems or behaviors that are actually, harmful or unjust.
Yeah, but that kind of self-reflection, it's so important if we're serious about wanting to build a world that's more in line with those values of compassion and justice and sincerity.
Right. It's about holding ourselves accountable.
Yes.
Both as individuals and as a whole community.
Yeah, I agree.
So as we kind of come to the end of our deep dive here, I'm left with this feeling of hope, but also responsibility.
I can see that.
Hope because, this chapter really shows us what's possible when we put faith and community and sincerity at the center of how we live our lives.
Yeah.
But responsibility because, it's challenging us to really confront hypocrisy and to actively work towards creating a world that's more just and compassionate.
Yeah, beautifully said. It's like a call to action for all of us to try to embody these values in our own lives and to work together to make them a reality.
Well, thank you so much for taking us on this journey through the mobilization. It's been a really fascinating and thought-provoking conversation.
It really has. The pleasure was all mine.
And to all of you listening, thank you so much for joining us for another deep dive. We hope you enjoyed it and we hope it gave you some things to think about. Remember, The journey of learning and self-discovery, it never really ends. So keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep striving to make the world a little bit better. Until next time.